What diplomatic battles will he be picking in 2018? In his New Year's address to foreign ambassadors, France's new president, positioning himself once again as the anti-Trump by suggesting that dialogue is the way forward in places like Syria and Iran. As head of a NATO member with a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, Emmanuel Macron also touting his upcoming April summit on terrorism financing and the one he'll be attending next month in Senegal on helping education in the developing world. Yes, Donald Trump in the White House seems to have left the French president as interim guardian of the temple of liberal values. We say interim guardian. How France fares on the world stage depends in part on the fate of Germany's chancellor. And as long as Angela Merkel remains bogged down in protracted coalition talks, Macron's ambitions for European reform, well, they'll remain at least partially in limbo. We're going to ask how his plans for a more integrated core Europe will weather the storm of Brexit and the sometimes illiberal backlash against Brussels being felt strongly in places like Central and Eastern Europe. And by the way, after a frenzied December that saw the president host a climate summit and trot the globe, his agenda for January has filled up fast. The now 40-year-old Macron making his first visit to China next week before speaking at Davos later in the month. We'll be talking about it today in the France 24 debate. We're looking at Macron's world, and with us, Macron supporter Lex Paulsen, who teaches rhetoric at the prestigious French political science institute Sciences Po. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Good to be back.
Happy New Year as well to independent journalist Dmitry Dikochko. Who's also
Happy New Year.
You've got a few busy weeks ahead. You're
oh yes,
organizing a book fair on the Russian literature.
Yes,
that's in
the mairie of the 5th arrondissement,
the city hall of the 5th arrondissement of Paris.
Yes.
Okay, that's coming. What are the dates?
3rd and 4th February.
3rd and the 4th of February, okay. From London, Yascha Mounk, lecturer on government at Harvard University and the author of The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. Happy New Year to you and welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much. Happy New Year, Francois.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate, straight out of the Bismarck playbook. Macron reminding foreign ambassadors that diplomacy is the art of the possible as he contemplates a 2018 where Assad is sure to stay in power. Iraq still has to be rebuilt after ISIS. He also took what sounds a lot like an opposite tack to Donald Trump's call to openly back those protests that are going on right now in Iran.
This crisis comes from the free expression of the Iranian people. It clearly shows that change does not come from the outside, but from within. Change will only come from the Iranian people, and our role is to be on the lookout and remain demanding, vigilant observers of that process. We must make sure that no fundamental rights are trampled on.
A change does not come from the outside. Of course, that was the tack that Barack Obama took when there were the protests in Iran in 2009.
That's right, and I actually had the pleasure of being on the ground in Cairo during the Arab Spring after Obama's Cairo speech and after the fall of Mubarak, and I can say that what Macron said is absolutely correct. That the international community can't create democracy on behalf of the people of Iran, the people of Syria, but they can provide useful support and stability to allow forces that aren't being heard in those societies to take their seat at the table. I think that France has a very important stabilizing role to play in an Iran which is seemingly becoming increasingly politically unstable.
You mentioned that Cairo speech. Hawks say Obama promised too much and too little at the same time.
It was a very difficult balancing act. On the one hand, to rebound from the neoconservative Bush era version of promoting democracy, which was based around military occupation and then throwing free elections as soon as possible. And I think both Obama and Macron realized that democracy is a process. It doesn't happen just on election day.
Yascha Mounk, listening to the words of Emmanuel Macron about what's going on right now in Iran, is he the heir to Barack Obama?
I don't know if he's the heir to Barack Obama, but I think it's very important that he speaks out clearly in favor of the protest in Iran. It's true that this is not something that France can actively do anything about, nor is it something that Germany or the United States should actively do anything about. But I've been quite shocked by how mealy-mouthed a lot of the pronouncements of American and German and other politicians have been over the last days, making it sound nearly like Donald Trump's famous remark in August that there's some very fine people on both sides. It's very clear which side we as citizens of liberal democracies should be on here. It is the fight of people who don't want to live in a theocracy, who want more democratic participation, who want to free themselves from the rule of mullahs. And obviously all we can do is to give some distant assistance and hope that these protests succeed. But I think the reluctance of politicians in many countries and of media and journalists in many countries to say clearly which side we should be on here and which side stands for values that we share has been a little concerning to me.
And of course, his Iran comments, Yasha, are in stark contrast to the muted reaction to the crackdown in Egypt when President Sisi visited Paris. Are there double standards on the part of Macron?
Well, to some degree, yes. I think that there's always a difficult question in international politics about what the best available option is. I think in moments in which there are protesters who do seem to be calling for more democracy and so on, it's especially important to be clear about the fact that we support them. That doesn't mean that you can't sometimes have alliances that are uncomfortable, if that is the best option you have in the region. But you should always be clear that you are on the side of democracy and that you're willing to embrace forces that have a realistic shot at moving these societies towards.
Dimitri Dikochko, you agree?
Well, I think it's a pity you haven't given the end of the quotes of Macron, because he said just after that when the changes came from outside, and we have tried that, it was worse than the situation which was before. And I would say that is exactly the Russian position also. So it means that there is something possible for a dialogue, in fact. I would say that about Syria, he has also made statement about the fact that some countries only could solve a problem like Syria. But in fact, it was not criticizing only the Astana process, because it is true that Western countries have not participated in this Astana process, which has been led only by Russia, Iran, and Turkey. But there was something successful with this Astana process, and it was not against Geneva.
All right, but if we take what Yasha was saying, that you have to speak out, right? What do you do when you're Emmanuel Macron and the evidence continues to mount of chemical gas attacks in Syria on the part of the government against the people back in April?
There are not evidence on that. And
that's
happily,
according to the United Nations.
No, it is not. And they have not accepted to make an inquiry on the spot. Neither at the airport,
François, may I say that
neither
it's a
at
little shocking
I don't remember the name of the place where this attack was done. The inquiry has not been done.
You're saying that there is no evidence. Yasha Monk.
No, there was no evidence.
I mean, so first of all, there's very, very clear evidence. And secondly, I have to say that I'm both impressed and shocked by the chutzpah of saying that, you should be like Russia and just stand by the wayside and realize that no kind of interference can help, when Russia over the last days has been bombing civilians in Idlib, crushing the opposition to Assad, and being a very, very active participant in the theater in Syria, not on the side of democracy, but on the side of its dictatorial ally, Bashar al-Assad.
The main opposition in Idlib was the opposition which was coming from Aleppo, and it was mainly people of al-Nusra.
Right, we're getting off the track if we start to have a debate about Syria, but nonetheless, the 2 points of views are there. Another point of view we're going to hear from on Friday is that of Turkey's president when it comes to the Iran crisis. And on the eve of his visit, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's spokesperson taking what sounds somewhat like Emmanuel Macron's tack, with a much more pointed dig at Washington over its support for the protests in Iran.
Iran's peace and tranquility matter a lot to us. I have to say that if some people attempt to cause a stir in Iran from outside, it will only provoke a backlash. Once again, I'd like to stress that we cannot accept any interference through outside statements and tweets aimed at disrupting the society's peace and tranquility.
Of course, it doesn't mean that Erdogan and Macron are singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to Iran or much else. How does Emmanuel Macron handle a Turkish president who has a strong expatriate community in this country, but who also has, flouted human rights in the post-coup crackdown, most notably with the jailing of journalists and the such?
It's a very difficult position. I think what Macron brings that other world leaders haven't yet brought to this discussion is an understanding of the relationships between the security and the military issues on the one hand, and the immigration and education issues at home on the other hand. I think that for Europe to effectively create a dialogue with Turkey over its human rights issues, of course, it has to, at the same time, achieve a consensus on how to deal with the refugee problem, how to stabilize the flow of arms and the flow of humanitarian assistance into these camps. So I think Macron brings an understanding of the interrelationships that go beyond just the military and diplomatic, but that also is backed by the actual threat of force that France brings, that, say, Germany or the European Commission in itself can't do. And so France, I think, has, as Yasha said, both a very strong moral position to assert, but also a kind of leverage that America is not willing to do for a view of human rights, and that no one else in Europe is able to bring.
And we forget that France and Turkey are both NATO members, along with the United States, by the way.
I think the whole rest of the world is trying to forget who's president of the United States right now. And you see with the speech by the Turkish foreign minister, the idea that we have a president who is willing to tweet in real time completely uninformed responses to world events, it actually puts France and Turkey in a sense in the same boat, because both countries are dealing with the largest military and economic power in the world, led currently by a completely unpredictable, uninformed, and uninterested leader who is talking about the size of his nuclear button. And so in that sense, for the moment, France and Turkey very much have common cause.
Yasha Monk, the NATO leadership, what does it seem like right now?
Well, I mean, I'm a little worried about the fact that the ascent of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States makes a lot of people in Europe seemingly think that they have more in common with Recep Erdogan, who is brutally crushing the opposition in Turkey, or with people like Vladimir Putin, who is incredibly repressive within his country, than with the United States. I am a very loud and persistent critic of Trump. I think that he is a terrible president who's doing quite horrifying things to the United States. But nevertheless, the United States remains a liberal democracy that is part of Western alliance structures. And for all of the unpredictability and all of the concern about Donald Trump, I think it would be very, very bad for the survival of liberal democracies and the survival of the liberal international order if countries like France and Germany were to conclude that they have more in common with Turkey and Russia than we do with the United States.
Dimitri Dukochko?
You know, when there was this coup d'etat attempt in Turkey, the Russian rule should be studied, and I think it will be in the future. But of course, Russia has helped the Turkish president. And the analysis is that there was the military who went against the Turkish president were helped by the United States.
What proof do you have of that?
It was. I know that Russians have played the role.
Right, but what proof do you have that the United States somehow helped in the attempted?
That is what is considered by Turkish, and what is considered by Russia.
That's what's said, but I mean, it's a pretty far-fetched
of course,
allegation.
Yes, I know, yeah. Well,
maybe we could pick up on...
You know, it's quite difficult to know who in the United States have supported these or these camps.
I think we're in an age of fake news where facts are being fabricated on perhaps on both sides of the Atlantic. But just to pick up on Yasha's point, I don't think that Macron necessarily has to compromise European values for the sake of building a better working relationship with Turkey. In fact, I would hate to see that happen. I think what we're seeing, however, is that with the decline of American influence in Europe and American influence as a problem solver in the Middle East, France has to somehow find a way of resolving issues related to terrorism and immigration, which are common challenges faced by Turkey and Europe without compromising on issues of human rights.
Yasha, your native Germany does not have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. These days, with Brexit going on, with Donald Trump, what hopes do you have when it comes to France at the Security Council?
Well, I think it's actually a common set of questions. The question is whether France and Germany are willing to step up to the responsibility that they now have as some of the only liberal democracies with clear leadership. I think France actually tends to be more willing to do that, because it has long been had a seat on the Security Council, because it's often long seen itself as a missionary nation that has a real role to play in the world. Because it spends more on its military per capita, so it's actually able to do things. But France's ability is limited. The ability of any one European country on its own is limited. And so it really would take cooperation between France and Germany in order to take on the mantle of the United States as co-leaders of a free world.
And when we come back, we're going to be taking a look. When we come back, we're going to be taking a look at who takes up the mantle when it comes to the European Union. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
I'm Sarah Morris and I'm France 24's correspondent in Madrid. I'll bring you the latest news on Spain and Portugal, two countries battling to leave behind years of austerity. Join me live and check out my reports on France 24 and France24.com.
Sarah Morris, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen.
In Western Africa, Sierra Leone's sandy beaches may be postcard perfect, but a decade of civil war and the recent Ebola epidemic have made tourists scarce. To stimulate its economy, Sierra Leone organises beauty contests to find the next beauty queen. Just like former Miss Universe contestant Hawa Kamara, candidates embody the country's hope for a brighter future. But beyond their beauty, their requisite modern and positive image holds the promise of restoring Sierra Leone from her brokenness.
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.
Sports, presented by Ketavan Gojestani.
France 24 keeps you up to date with all the latest from the world of sport. All the action, all the results, all the emotion.
Sports on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories that we're following for you in the newsroom. Turkey slams as scandalous the fraud conviction in a New York federal court of a senior banker after a trial where the star witness implicated President Erdogan and his government. Steve Bannon says he still supports Donald Trump day in, day out, this despite the threat of lawsuits over the release of a kiss and tell book about the U.S. president. Niagara Falls frozen, snowfall in Florida, blizzard conditions battering the east coast of the United States. The African Footballer of the Year to be unveiled in an hour's time in Accra. We will have full coverage right here on France 24. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And as the new year begins in France, the tradition is New Year's greetings. They extend almost throughout the month when you're the president. Yesterday it was the press. Today it was the foreign ambassadors, and we're talking about the diplomatic agenda of France for 2018 in the company of Macron supporter Lex Paulsen, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, independent journalist Dimitri Dikochko, welcome back as well, to Yasha Monk, who teaches at Harvard University, the author of The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger, and How to Save It. Should be noted that in that big speech to ambassadors, which went on for a long time, by the way, Lex Paulsen, his speeches are a little long. Has anyone told the president that he does ramble a little bit?
This is the problem. When he listens to 25 people, you have to fit in 25 paragraphs. Right. It's kind of a professional hazard.
Okay. It could be a little long.
Could be a little long sometimes.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. There was a little bit about the European Union, but not a whole lot. And we'll be asking why to our panel right away. Yasha Monk, the fact that he did mention attempts to reform, trying to get the curtailing of what they call posted workers, where you're paid in one country to do a job in another. But it was short, the Europe segment of that speech, and many presume it's because, well, Europe runs on the Franco-German motor, and half of that motor is stuck in protracted coalition talks. I'm, of course, talking about Germany's Angela Merkel.
Yeah, I mean, he set out his vision for Europe at his Sorbonne speech a few months ago. So I mean, part of the reason may simply be that he felt like, people knew what he thinks about it. You're absolutely right that the German government has not yet formed. It looks likely that a grand coalition will form. So three months or so ago, we all thought that a so-called traffic light coalition would form, so it could still fail. But even if a grand coalition forms, I think that this is not likely to be an energetic government that is in the market for bold reform. Angela Merkel is slowly on her last legs. She's rapidly losing authority within her own party. The Social Democrats are desperately looking for a profile for how to make sure that they get seen and counted in that coalition in a way that they didn't for the past 4 years. I think it's difficult to imagine that coalition being really visionary about how to reform the European Union.
Now, the Macron way is to make Europe a bigger part of the agenda to counter the rise of populism and the far right, the same rise that we're witnessing in Germany. You're suggesting that the next government of Germany will be low-key when it comes to that reform. Are you sure?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, you have Martin Schulz suggesting a few weeks ago a future as the United States of Europe, and even saying that countries that wouldn't sign up would essentially be thrown out of the European Union. I think that's meant in a pro-European way, one of the surest way of dissolving the European Union. But in the end, you're only going to have reform of the European Union if you are also going to have more fiscal union, a move towards much more financial co-responsibility. And while there are parts of the Social Democrats who are willing to do that, relatively small parts actually, it is quite clear that there's very large parts of the Christian Democrats who are not willing to go along with that. And since there's lots of people within the Christian Democratic Party who would love a course that allows them to topple Angela Merkel and move the party to the right, I don't think that she would be so foolish as to try and go ahead with it.
Lex Paulsen, you just heard Yasha Monk there pour cold water on the chances of a more integrated Europe, the way Macron spelled it out in that big speech at the Sorbonne a few months back.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Yasha's analysis from what I know a lot less about German politics than he does. But I think that what he's pointing out, though, is that there are several different aspects of European reform that don't all have to necessarily work together. There is the fiscal harmonization or the kind of the fiscal consolidation of powers. There is the creation of a common defense policy and perhaps a European level army. But I think fundamentally the most important reforms are political. Unless we can create, and this is what Macron has said through his campaign and through his presidency, unless we can create European institutions that involve citizens directly in participating in decisions that affect their lives, you're going to have more Polands, more Hungarys, and more Erdogans. And I think Macron's call for European democratic conventions to bring citizens into engaging in the European project is the fundamental reform that has to happen this year, or else we're going to see more populism.
And Macron, in his speech, did mention that populism, most notably when it came to the way that the global economy is creating upheavals.
Today, we're facing a crisis of globalization, a crisis of contemporary capitalism, which has not been able to regulate its own excesses, and which has led to unbearable social and economic inequalities, as well as unbearable inequalities with respect to climate change. We're also experiencing a crisis of democracy all over the world. Liberal and open democracies have struggled to preserve their unity and their strength, and we're seeing more and more people tempted by authoritarianism and nationalism.
Dmitry Dukochko, you share that analysis?
You know, he has also spoken during the greetings on the New Year about the nation, and he has stressed very much the word nation and the comprehension of a nation, which is, I would say, could please some people he calls populists.
But there's something for everyone, is what you're saying.
I would say that, you know, it's always the discussion, what Europe do we want, and especially in France and in Britain. Do we want a Europe of nations, or do we want a federal Europe? And by talking about nation, there were two, I would say, there were two directions. One is to stress the importance of the nation, and for democratic functionment of the democracy, it is very, very important, the nation, because we haven't invented anything else to elect people, as you say, who are in charge of our destiny. And then there is something, and that is in the French spirit, against communitarism, which is one of the problems which exists in France. In the British culture and the Anglo-Saxon culture, I would say, the communitarism is not understood the same way as
multiculturalism is embraced, whereas
it's not exactly multiculturalism; it is communitarism. I mean, we have the I don't know how
France,
it's
always
a problem to translate laïcité.
I think it's true.
Secularism.
Well, there is no translation into English, but I think your point about the nation, which I think your point about the nation is really critical, because I think as you know, as Yasha was pointing out, it depends how you feel about the word nation. On the one hand, those who are fearing a more federal Europe will look at this as an expression of French sovereignty.
It was very clever.
But on the other hand, I take a second reading. I think Macron was trying to obviously please both sides of the argument, but I take another reading, which is to say that by asking for French people to feel themselves part of a national project, he's also asked them to feel part of a European project. That you are involved in this, that you are direct, that it's not just elect us and then go away for 5 years and we'll make all the decisions. It's elect us and join us in this project. And unless he can get the French people to put aside a little bit of their cynicism and put aside a little bit of, keep their skepticism, but put aside their cynicism and join in building these new policies and institutions, the European project might not last.
Yasha Monk, when you hear the word nation out of the mouth of Emmanuel Macron, what does it mean to you?
It comforts me. It comforts me because I think there's very different ideas of a nation. And one of the great causes of liberal democracy in the early 21st century has to be to defend a non-populist concept of what the nation is. Now, for populists, and by way for authoritarian rulers like Vladimir Putin, it's very clear what the nation is. First of all, it is ethnically and religiously exclusionary. So only people who are ethnically French or Russian, in quotation marks, get to belong to people. And secondly, it means that you have to ruthlessly defend the interests of your own nation as though you're in a zero-sum competition with everybody else. Now, I think that liberal nationalists like Emmanuel Macron very clearly argue against that in two ways. First of all, they say, no, we have an inclusive concept of the nation, which obviously emphasizes what we Frenchmen have in common, what Germans have in common, but includes people of different skin colors, different ethnicities, of different religions. And Macron did that brilliantly in a campaign speech in Marseille, where he said, look at this audience with people from all over the world, from the Ivory Coast, from Senegal, from Italy, from Turkey. This is the people of France. Look here, ladies and gentlemen of the Front National, this is what it means to be proud. And the second thing that he does is to say, you can be proud to be French, and you can believe in the importance of the French nation and recognize that this is conformable with having more international cooperation and being a member of the European Union. And in both of those ways, I'm not worried at all about Macron talking about NATO. I think he gives it the right content that we need in order to defend against the noxious notion of nation.
That's right. See, he sounds more American than the Americans these days in that regard.
Yeah, except at the same time, Yasha, we see Europe where those who don't share those values when it comes to how the nation interacts with Brussels seem to be gaining momentum, be it Poland, be it Hungary, be it Austria, which has now sort of gone into that column, if you will. Is Emmanuel Macron's bet for 2018 to convince Central and Eastern Europeans, or is it to, well, go with a 2 or 3 speed Europe?
So in relation to Central Europe, I think this is the biggest question for the future of the European Union. For a long time, we've only thought about the euro, which is obviously a continuing problem, so it is looking a little bit more stable at the moment. But we've neglected the fact that in Hungary, democracy is under very serious threat. And Poland, where the judiciary is no longer independent, where the media are under real stress, is very quickly going in the same direction. And there's a lot of tactical debate that I hear. Would it be counterproductive to discipline Poland and Hungary? I don't know the questions to those. I think in the end, the ability of the European Union to influence domestic politics in both Poland and Hungary is very limited. But what we can do is to make clear what the nature of the European Union is. And if the European Union is going to be anything worthwhile, it has to be first and foremost a club of democratic nations. And as long as Viktor Orban in Hungary and Kaczynski in Poland are rapidly taking the country out of the club of democracies, they should also be isolating themselves within the Europe.
Dimitri Dukoshkov?
Don't forget the French referendum of 2005, please.
Where they voted against the European Constitution.
Of course. It is not only about Poland and Hungary and Austria. I think it is also the problem inside France. The way French people is considering, I would say, the European bureaucracy. It is felt like that among a large, I would say, majority of people in France. Don't think that it is because in the elites the European Union is very popular.
Okay, so what's your...
I'm sorry to nuance the point slightly, Dimitri, but to say that just because French people voted against the European referendum in 2005, that number of people is anti-European, I think oversimplifies the question.
They are not anti-European. They are very skeptical about the European bureaucracy in Brussels.
As they should be. But we all know that in a democracy, the answer you get depends on the question that you ask. And the question that Macron is asking isn't, should we keep Europe just as it is, but does France have a role to play in remaking Europe? And do all French citizens have a stake, as Yasha said, both in their country and in a larger European project that, frankly, can only succeed if France helps it to succeed? I think that most French people are going to say yes to that, but I think that the path forward to them participating is still yet to be defined. All
right, so France has this energetic leader who, whether you agree with him or not, is capturing a lot of attention these days. Whether or not, it's a question we ask often, France is boxing above its own weight category. We'll get a measure of that next week. He'll be in China, his first trip there. And the French have not fared very well in terms of making a splash in China, most notably compared to the Germans in the past. How will Macron do?
Well, we're seeing a transition in the Chinese economy from a heavily industrial sector, which the Germans were better positioned to exploit those circumstances, to more of a services-based economy, which the French are in relatively better position with its strong services sector and luxury goods, which are markets that are expanding rapidly. So there's a strong economic interest for France. But beyond that, France is showing, or Macron, his government is showing a willingness to engage diplomatically at a level of nuance that, frankly, the current American government has failed to do. And by showing its engagement in the North Korea crisis and questions about territorial sovereignty and questions related to Myanmar, that these are areas where the French traditional strength in diplomacy and understanding the nuances of diplomatic negotiation, I think, will make the French-Chinese relationship especially important to world stability moving forward.
Yasha Monk, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think obviously Germany has very strong strengths in manufacturing and so on, which have allowed it to build these deep relationships with China early on. There is a big question about the degree to which China can become one of the defenders of the liberal international order. We know that last year Xi Jinping went to Davos and made a big splash by essentially casting himself as a principal defender, at least, of free trade around the world after the election of Donald Trump. I think that it would behoove us to be a little skeptical of those claims. China does have an interest in free trade, that is good, but there are large portions of the liberal international order which China are increasingly authoritarian leadership, increasingly one-man leadership, is unlikely to help to uphold. Obviously, China is big to ignore, and it's perfectly fine for Emmanuel Macron to go and initiate economic relationships, try and strengthen diplomatic relationships. But we shouldn't delude ourselves about the need to actually step up our own capacity of acting in the world, in Europe, and the need for rescuing the United States from Donald Trump, so that the United States can once again become what it always has been, the garant of a liberal international.
The connection is getting a little weak there with London. Apologies for that. Dimitri Kochko, let me ask you, because as Yasha just said, a year ago, the big star at Davos was Xi Jinping as the guardian of the free trade order. That's how he painted himself.
As a European,
and this year, it's going to be Emmanuel Macron who will be speaking at Davos. What do you want to hear from Macron?
As a European, I would like Macron to be able to pull back Russia to Europe, because the leader, Putin, has met the most this year where Xi Jinping was Chinese. And the relationship between China and Russia, despite all the contradictions, all the future, all the expectation you can make about the future, are very strong. And it is because we Europeans have rejected Russia, and Russia is a European country. And I think Macron is a very pragmatic president. He will go to Russia in June at St. Petersburg, forum. That is very important. He has met Putin here in Paris just after the Hollande's policy, which was, I think, the worst during the Fifth Republic. But anyway, I hope that something will be arranged with Russia for our sake, European, economic, political, strategical.
Yasha Monk, ever since the crisis in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, it's been said so many times that Angela Merkel was the one who wanted to bring Russia back into the tent. Will Emmanuel Macron be doing that?
Well, look, I don't know. I think that he should be skeptical about the degree to which we can do that while Russia is continuing to annex part of the sovereign territory of another nation. I agree with Dimitri absolutely that Russia can be a European power. I think European countries have wanted Russia to be a European power since the end of the Cold War. I myself have family links to Russia. I think we should absolutely aspire to make it part of European political structures and of European culture. But the absolute precondition for that is that Russia has minimal respect for the rules by which Europe plays. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it was the first time since the end of World War II
Russia has not invaded Ukraine.
Had been annexed by another country And then you have propagandists of the Russian government making obviously fabricated claims, like the fact that Russia did not invade the Ukraine, right here on the channel. So, look, I would love for Emmanuel Macron to improve relationship with Russia if Russia started to seriously commit itself to the most minimal rule by which sovereign nations should play. Unfortunately, I don't see much possible.
Lex Paulsen?
I agree with Yasha. I think the difficult situation is using the word Russia does this or Russia does that. The problem that Macron has to face is the same one fundamentally as in Turkey, which is to say that these are companies at the edge of the European consensus, where there are substantial parts of civil society in both Russia and Turkey that adhere to values of free speech and values of freedom of conscience and of the press, but that their governments are backsliding dramatically. And the question is, how can Macron, Merkel, those who support European and liberal democratic values can strengthen ties beyond just with the head of state to other forces in the society? The fact is, Vladimir Putin's been incredibly effective in eliminating any potential opposition, eliminating any potential civil society that could step up and defend values inside his own borders, which makes Macron and Europe's job that much harder.
Lex Paulsen, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Dimitri Dukochko and Yasha Monk for being with us from London. Stay with us. We're going to hear from another precinct on this matter as it's time for Media Watch. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
James, we've been talking about how to handle Russia. We got an inkling of it. He never mentioned Russia by name in his New Year's greetings to the press on Wednesday. But you kind of got the sense with the announcement that there'd be a bill cracking down on fake news, that it was squarely aimed at RT, which has just opened a French language version.
That's right. They had their website already up and running, but the TV, the French version of RT is now up, has been launched this year. But if we go back to May, June of last year when Vladimir Putin was in Versailles, we will remember, I think a lot of us will remember in any case, that rap on the knuckles to Emmanuel Macron gave to Sputnik and Russia Today right on front of Vladimir Putin, saying that it was essentially propaganda. And so I suppose it's no surprise that perhaps this is the logical consequence of that way of viewing things. So a law against fake news, it has produced quite a lot of reactions across the spectrum. You have Alain Juppé, who of course was also in the running for a presidential candidacy for the Conservative Party, and he is completely in agreement with Emmanuel Macron. He says combating fake news is a way to protect democracy, and it's essential to bring up our young people with a critical sense, in other words, to get rid of anything that could interfere with that. You have other voices as well expressing opinions of a similar nature on Twitter, saying perhaps that this law should be extended elsewhere, that it makes complete sense. Now, you have a lot of people expressing a degree of support like that for Emmanuel Macron. But just to show you the range of criticisms going from the idea that perhaps the spirit of what he's trying to implement is sound, but perhaps the way it is implemented could be tweaked. And then you have others who are just flat out criticising. No surprise that the far-right National Front Party would criticise this and evoke images of Orwell, saying, is he trying to put in place a ministry of truth? Other voices speaking of 1924, censorship of fake news.
1984.
Exactly. And now this is a voice from InfoWars, which you could put in the category of alt-right and even some would say fake news. But so they are expressing concern, perhaps not surprisingly, saying that who will decide? Will it be government bureaucrats? And this is chilling. Well, I think Macron did say that it will be a judge. It won't be government bureaucrats. But you have other voices then saying, well, what about how this is actually going to be implemented? For example, the Huffington Post here is saying, how do you determine what fake news is? If good faith is intact when a piece of information is published, then actually that isn't fake news. So this is actually going to be quite a quagmire for those putting together the law, putting together the bill, to actually tread that fine line between determining how to censor verifiable fake news and how to verify it and how to not censor. So it is actually quite a difficult one, and many journalists, political journalists, have been pointing that out on social media. Good luck to those who will have to write up this bill. And this is Geraldine Wessner, who for the Europe 1 radio station has a fact-checking segment every morning, and she lists out all of the reasons why she thinks this is actually going to be very difficult to do. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the I never know how to translate his party's name. France.
He calls it Unbowed.
There you go. France Unbowed.
The far left party.
He's saying, look, he
create
already
an ethics committee. Is what he
create an ethics committee. This is less likely to be, to have so many pitfalls as a law. And just finally, I'll just finish with this one detail. In 2017, Wired magazine is pointing out here, using information from the Freedom House non-profit, that the principles of internet freedom are under attack worldwide, and it's actually getting worse year after year after year. And there's one interesting piece of information. While you have bots, and we've been seeing this disseminating false information across social media, including government-sponsored bots, you also have now countries such as Venezuela, Turkey and the Philippines, which are encouraging government employees to disseminate sort of information as well, opinion shapers. So it's a kind of a pushback against social media out of a fear of, I suppose, disinformation being spread. But it's perhaps another form of disinformation.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. There's so much more to say about it. James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.